Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on the importance of a seamless cloud governance strategy. We really appreciate your presence and try and make sure your next 60 minutes are well invested. Your speakers today are Tony Rylance. He's a Vice President of Solutions Engineering at CoreStack and has a rich experience as a cloud architect. Hi, Tony. Welcome.
Thanks. Thank you. Look forward to going through this with everybody. Thanks for your time.
Great. And myself, Abid. I head the product marketing at CoreStack, and we really look forward for having an interactive and productive session with you all. Let's have a quick look at what we're going to cover today in the next 50-55 minutes. To start with, we'll spend a few minutes on defining the cloud governance, the common challenges enterprises like you want to address as a part of the governance strategy. What are the different stages which are important to be considered in cloud governance? And importantly, we'll also hear Tony's views on what an effective cloud governance framework should be. What are those elements that have to be considered in coming up with a very robust cloud governance strategy? We'll also spend a few minutes giving you an overview of CoreStack's solution, and we'll walk you through some of the key elements of cloud governance, what CoreStack offers. And towards the end of this session, we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. But please note that we will have the recording of this webinar available to you. If you want to have more detailed session or have some questions which we could not cover in this webinar, please feel free to drop us an email and our team will be happy to talk to you. On that note, Tony, I'll pass it on to you. So please get started with our cloud governance framework slides.
Thank you. And just from a housekeeping standpoint, feel free to ask any questions as we go through this. There's a question and answer section in the webinar toolbar. So at any time, if you have a question, if we can't answer it during the presentation, we'll look at question and answers at the end and go through them. So why cloud governance? This was a report I went through. It was last year's Gartner report around governance. And this really struck me as very shocking. The title here was the point was 99% of exploited vulnerabilities. So those vulnerabilities that are attacked in an enterprise have been known by security and IT professionals for at least 1 year. If you read through the report, it talks about why that happens, but a lot of it is due to not having appropriate visibility as well as tooling to be able to repair the issues or the vulnerabilities when they're found. And then a third of successful attacks experienced by enterprise will be on their shadow IT resources. This is what we see most of the time, where some user, some line of business user or developer will be utilizing the cloud for different development or migration projects that they're working on. And throughout that process, maybe they forget to secure a workload or forget to set the storage service to be private. And we see a lot of vulnerabilities and attacks happen through that shadow IT. So being able, again, to have visibility is key here when we're talking about governance. And if you look at overall governance as a whole, the business, there's a lot of different things from a regulatory compliance standpoint that also are affecting the market. For instance, in Europe, they've rolled out GDPR, which is a very strict data protection and privacy regulatory compliance for enterprises. And that's actually affecting businesses all around the world. And we're seeing that here in the US as well. So there's a lot of eyes on governance, but there's also a lot of question marks. How do we solve all of these problems? Well, if we look at what governance is, from our standpoint, cloud governance is a framework to define how you want to utilize your infrastructure. What's the process? What's the criteria? what sort of policies, what's the design look like, how do we secure our infrastructure, how are we using and consuming that, and more importantly, how are we operating and managing that infrastructure? What level of visibility do we have? And where can we automate? Automation is key when you're talking about governance, because anytime you have to wait for a manual process for someone to go through checks and balances, it's going to take time. It's going to leave those vulnerabilities, like we talked about, for upwards of a year, where enterprises know about vulnerabilities, but it's on a backlog. They haven't had the opportunity to go out and fix it. So anytime we can streamline that process, automate that process is key when talking about governance. So at the end of the day, what governance is, it's to ensure that we, as an enterprise, we're doing the right things, we're doing it the right way, and most importantly, that we're verifying the outcome. This is where I think when companies define their governance strategy, they don't focus on the metric piece. How do we build metrics and success criteria around our governance framework, our governance story? If you look off, and we'll get into this more later in the presentation, but if you look here off to the left, I have a triangle where when most companies, when they look at governance and security specifically, most of the focus will be around prevention. How do we prevent someone from leveraging our vulnerabilities? The illustration I always like to use is your house. Most people are going to look at, okay, we put locks on the doors, we make sure that our windows are shut and locked up, maybe we have a fence around the yard, and then they'll implement some detection, put in an alarm system that triggers when there's windows, maybe they have cameras outside. But the big gap that we find in this space, specifically when we're talking about enterprise governance, is around what do we do after we detect an issue? This is where if we don't have automation, where if it's just it fires up a ticket and then someone has to manually go solve this problem, or your alarm system's going off, but it doesn't call the appropriate authorities, it doesn't actually take an automated action or correction. That's where most enterprises have the biggest issues as it relates to governance and specifically security. So when you look at all these things, okay, we're doing the right things, doing them the right way, and verifying the outcome. When you talk about governance, especially if you're talking with line of business users or developers, they look at any type of checks and balances to verify how they're doing things as a roadblock. So the goal of governance and building a governance framework should be governing the use but not blocking it. It's mitigating risks versus rewards. A lot of cases, right, it puts up roadblocks to that path to innovation. But a good governance framework should actually speed up that process to innovation. It should implement automation tools which can actually streamline that path and make that path to innovation faster. So the goal is to remove as many roadblocks as we can, but still be able to have the controls, the handrails in place to be able to make sure that we're doing the right things the right way and verifying the outcome. So it's kind of four main areas when you're talking about governance from an IT infrastructure standpoint: security and compliance. This is where most people, when talking about governance, this is where most people think about the most. And I would say probably is the focus area, is around securing our infrastructure. And second is around regulatory compliance. How do we have visibility into our infrastructure? How do we be able to run audits against that infrastructure? And then how do we run reports in case we are audited? The second area is around provisioning. So this is a big one in that a lot of, I read a recent report and we didn't have time to add that into this presentation. It just came out a few months ago. It was from the Identity Theft Service. I forget, we'll put a link in the last slide of the presentation for where I got all of this information. But most of the issues when it comes down to vulnerabilities being attacked or breaches on the enterprise, it usually comes down to someone fat fingering the configuration or misconfiguring the infrastructure or the resource in most cases. So being able to have automation tools that can manage and streamline the provisioning process as well as remove user error is key when you're defining your governance strategy and framework. Third is around spending. Now, most people don't look at governance as spend as being part of the governance framework, but it's actually key in order to not only successfully adopt the cloud, to do it well at scale while not blowing out and completely destroying the budget, which is the reason most enterprises move to cloud. Be able to move their CapEx to OpEx, to be able to change that conversation. So it's important when defining your governance framework, and we'll go into what a governance framework is here in a few minutes, but to include areas to optimize spend, as well as to have visibility into your cost and where to optimize or automate resources at all possible. Spend is also twofold. There's hard costs, like resources sitting out there not being used. We could turn those down and save CapEx or OpEx. And then there's soft cost, automating day-to-day activities so that your resources, whether they're line of business users or IT, can focus on the goals and initiatives that they need to make your business successful. And the fourth area is around visibility and operations. So being able to have complete visibility of all your resources and infrastructure, all your workloads and applications, what they are doing. Are those resources following our governance framework that as an enterprise we defined? And then from an operations standpoint, we talked about that a little bit, being able to automate as much of those processes as we can. So there's 3 stages of cloud governance, and these aren't official like industry standard stages. So imagine these silos as being blurred a little bit. But what we find is most enterprises we are talking to are between beginning and optimize. So they're integrated and migrated into the cloud, some of their workloads, maybe a few sandbox environments, test environments, or maybe they have some web apps and they're running production in the cloud. It's very reactive, so they'll utilize some monitoring tools or native services to gather information to make sure there's not security holes or that your applications are running at peak utilization. There's a lot of cost overruns where they don't really have, in the beginning phases, they don't have a good visibility into what is running in their infrastructure. Billing in this stage is a manual process in a lot of cases. A lot of customers we're talking to are downloading the native bills from the cloud providers and importing that into Excel and manually going through there to try to build out bill back to different departments. We also see disparate tools where it's kind of the Wild West in that anybody that is adopting or consuming the cloud uses whatever tool they want to help them be successful. So there's a breadth of different automation, management tools, runtime tools, operating system versions, how they develop software, the infrastructure sizes that they're using. And we see there's not a lot of cloud structure. What we find is most customers are kind of falling into this stage 2. They're starting to look at, well, how do we optimize not only our spend, but how can we streamline some of the day-to-day processes, as well as how does IT eliminate a lot of its backlog? See, what happens is the move to cloud, IT's lost a lot of control, which is fine. We want our users to be able to innovate, and we don't want them to be able to have to go through IT. However, by not going through IT, not being able to have the proper checks and balances in place, it makes it very difficult to be able to audit and then optimize. If you don't have access to the resources as well as their utilization, have monitoring stats over a time period, it's hard then to be able to optimize your spend, optimize your resources, to be able to consolidate, even migrate. And so what happens with a lot of customers in this stage, they end up deploying, migrating to the cloud, and everything then just kind of sits. They don't want to touch it. They don't want to move it. And so for stage 2, we really try to focus on optimizing what you have today, implementing tools, as well as starting to build a framework. Now, one of the most important things you can do when you're looking at utilizing the cloud from an enterprise standpoint, especially as you're looking at building out a governance framework, is to build a cloud center of excellence or a cloud steering group. Whoops. And I'll talk about specifically what that is here in a minute. And then there's mature. So this is the third stage. This is where you have tools that are running full automation from a governance self-service standpoint. So you have tooling that's been in place, it's integrated with your company's tooling and workloads, and fully automating the governance. So if a user spins up in an environment, violates your governance frameworks or violates a security policy, being able to automate that process of resolving that is key for stage 3. Agility and control and optimization, those are kind of the focus areas. How do we go to scale effectively without a ton of spend? And then how do we continually optimize what we have? And one of the cool things in this space is cloud has changed. New services are rolled out every quarter, hundreds of them across the different service providers. And these different tool sets bring all new levels of vulnerabilities, all new levels of control, visibility, as well as required skill set. So being able to optimize the onboarding of new services is also key to this phase, and having the right structure and governance framework in place to be able to handle that move and that adoption. So just diving into this a little bit, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But first, you want to identify the cloud steering group. So this is where we're in the beginning of stage 1, recognizing that we want to move to stage 2. For governance, the kind of industry standard framework has these 5 modules, which I'm going to go through here in a second. And then we're also trying to look at streamlining if you're an ISV or have a development process, a CI/CD pipeline, being able to figure out a way to optimize and automate the governance of that consumption. See, if your enterprise just has their workloads running in the cloud, there's not a lot of change. It's a lot easier to build a governance framework and support your infrastructure and to make sure there's no issues and vulnerabilities. However, when you have an organization that's developing, is constantly spinning up new environments, new workloads in the cloud, a lot of times maybe forgetting to shut them off, or moving workloads and forgetting to go back and shut down or terminate, delete the old backups, being able to automate that process is key from this phase. And when we look at a cloud steering group, this is something as an enterprise you want to promote internally. You want your individual contributors to want to be a part of this team. So most successful enterprises that have built out a governance framework and are doing this well, they will rotate their individual contributors on like a 12-month or 16-month cycle being part of this team. So it gives them an opportunity to be a team leader. It's a resume builder, as well as you can assign some KPIs and some business metrics around this. But the idea of building a cloud steering group or a cloud center of excellence is at the highest level, you want to have executive sponsorship to be able to have the power to enforce the framework that this group will end up defining. You want to have a project management lead, so someone that's managing the projects and the complete framework as a whole. And again, this is just really high level. There's actually a ton of documentation. We'll include that in with the information that we send, which will talk you through how to define this at each one of these levels. And they give you like baseline frameworks and templates to use as well. And then you'll have someone from a business relations manager standpoint. So it's going to manage this from the business level, report back to your executive sponsor. And then there's usually kind of 4 focus areas. There's the cloud infrastructure lead. So someone will be assigned as the lead to define your governance framework as it relates to your infrastructure, whether that's on-premise or in the cloud, hybrid, or multi-cloud. Second area is around same thing, building a framework for your DevOps and automation. So how are we adopting the cloud? What's our DevOps process look like? You know, where are our maintenance windows? What are our tagging standards? What tool set are we going to standardize on as a company? Maybe that's a few different tools, etc. And then cloud architect lead. This is going to be someone that's going to take lead from the workload standpoint. So they're going to define which workloads are production, which applications are production, which are staging, development, QA, etc. and then define the process and the framework around those workloads. So they're going to define the tagging standards. What tags do we want for all of our workloads? So maybe they say we want to make sure we have a cost center tag, an environment tag, and an application owner, a workload owner tag. As well as they're going to define the security parameters. So if this particular web application is going to need port 80 open to it, it's going to need HTML or browser support to this application, but everything else should be shut down. If it's an FTP server, okay, well then we need the appropriate ports open for that. And the fourth area is the one that most companies are just focusing on, is around security risk and regulatory compliance. And then from the individual contributor standpoint, again, this is just high level. So you'll usually have, 2 or 3 times as many individual contributors, assuming it's a mid-sized enterprise. But the key is you want to have an IC from each business segment and unit, from the actual engineers to developers to your operations or IT, application, web development team, security, etc. You want to have ICs from each department that understands their work, understands their goals and initiatives, and understands what's required in order to roll out a successful governance framework. All right, stage two. Stage two is where you really want to start focusing on automation. So you've defined your governance framework, you have your clear cloud steering group. Now it's time to go make changes happen, to commit, to move forward. And so in this phase, it's key, because if you define a governance framework and then everything to support that governance framework, all the checks and balances, if everything's manual, you'll never be able to successfully roll out that framework across your enterprise. So it's key to be able to standardize on automation tools that can help you achieve your governance framework. We have a platform, an automation platform, which we will do a quick demo on, just designed for this space. And then as you get into the maturity phase, again, a lot of this is around having the right tooling and services. It's really more around just defining the framework. So what tools are we going to use? Putting the right training and processes in place to allow your users to utilize those tools without slowing them down. Again, remember, it's about speeding up innovation. It's governing, having visibility, but speeding up innovation. Building if you are ISV and you're developing software, which most enterprises have a development team at some phase or another in their business, really focusing on defining that your CI/CD workflow. That's key, because that's where most vulnerabilities and violations are going to occur, in that dynamic, randomly spun up infrastructure. And then streamlining, being able to have visibility. Again, a lot of this is around having the right tooling in place. The service providers have their own services that will help provide you with the right visibility and monitoring for all of their services. But it's key to have a separate service that can actually monitor all of those individual services. And we'll get into more of that when we jump into the demo. And then from a governance framework standpoint, there's kind of 3 focus areas when you're looking at building out your framework. It's the people. So how do we enable our people? How do we put tooling and automation in place to streamline day-to-day processes, which goes into the second area, which is process. Building the appropriate processes in place in order to adopt and consume the cloud. From this standpoint, most of the service providers have kind of best practices for processes. So then it really comes down to, well, how do we implement those? Is there technology that can back the processes and enable the people? So it's kind of a 3-tiered focus here, three-pillar focus. So when you look at that from a tooling standpoint, Gartner, in their latest release of cloud management and governance, defined all of these functions, services, and tooling as requirements in order to have a good governance practice. So what we've done at CoreStack is to simplify this process. We've created a modularized framework, which we call the 4Cs of cloud governance. And so it's cloud operations, which focus on getting access, so asset management, discovery, so getting access to all the infrastructure, as well as automation, implementing automation tools to streamline the provisioning and orchestration, streamline the monitoring and the monitoring services, which rolls into compliance. So we have access to all that data. Now, how is our infrastructure doing? How compliant are they to our governance framework? So we defined how we want to use the cloud, but are our resources following that? Are our people, processes, and technology enabling that framework? Cost analytics. This is a big one and twofold. There's, again, the hard costs. So being able to have visibility into all the infrastructure, but then being able to make recommendations or being able to identify ways to automate or optimize your spend. And then the fourth is around consumption. How do we, again, remove the barriers, put in automation tools, streamline that process? Maybe if we've defined strict governance practices, are there things we can do to automate that so we don't put that load on our users? We just want our users to be able to spin up environments and develop and innovate. We don't want them to have to go through a long checklist of, okay, I have to have these security ports closed. I have to have this workload locked down to these certain IP addresses. I want to do weekly backups. I need to make sure I delete my old backups. I want to make sure my storage isn't public, blah, blah, blah. So anytime you can automate that is key here from a consumption standpoint. Another focus area that we like to focus on is building a self-service portal. So our platform has a self-service portal. So you predefine these workloads. If your enterprise has a handful of workloads that you need to constantly spin up, whether it's for production or development, QA, staging, etc., being able to define those workloads and give your users a place where they can just order them like they order something on Amazon, be able to order up a workload environment, have it built. That workload follows all your governance requirements, follows your processes, security parameters, etc., and then makes it available to the user to be able to automate that. It's kind of twofold there on consumption. So we look at a governance framework. It's really similar to our government in that you have your executive legislature, you have your organization, your high level office, you have your overall strategy, and then from a resource and infrastructure standpoint, what governance does is defines the laws, then polices those laws. Then there's accountability and reporting. So who's making violations or having violations? How are we policing? And then the fourth bucket is around assets, resources, shared resources. So schools, roads, etc. In order for that to be successful, right, or what we would like to see in a successful government is communication across all four of these pillars. And this is what will make up kind of the foundation for a good government or good governance framework. This is the four pillars of government at a very, 30,000 foot level view. So from a cloud governance standpoint, it's very similar. You define your cloud steering group, your executives that are verifying that as an enterprise, our governance framework is enabling us to achieve our goals and initiatives as a business. If governance is just put in place to put checks and balances and is not helping you achieve your overall goals and initiatives, then it's not going to be a successful practice. So it's key that your governance framework, as part of that, which is why you want executive sponsorship and executive project lead to manage the business side, the governance framework, it's key for that to enable you to achieve your goals and initiatives. Then it's about defining that framework and then putting in the processes and policies. So how are we going to consume the cloud? What are the appropriate policies? What are the procedures? What sort of tags, what sort of security holes do we need to make sure are closed, or maybe some are open? What sort of tooling and policing can we put in to make sure that these processes and policies are being followed? Getting access, so accounting as well as optimization. How can we verify that everyone's following these processes as well as is following our budget? And are there ways to optimize where we can? And then shared resource. So we have this shared infrastructure. Are there ways to not only optimize that, but can we share our infrastructure tooling in a better way? A lot of companies, again, like we talked about, every user may use their own set of tools. But as a business, can we standardize on some toolings where we can build, again, processes, build tooling for that, as well as visibility and reporting on those tooling, and make it available to the user? And then, of course, the key is communication, managing the complete cloud lifecycle. So it's a circle. That's why when you see a cloud lifecycle and a governance framework, it should always be in a circle because it's continuous. And then that makes up kind of the cloud governance framework. Now, every enterprise and organization's going to have a different focus, but at minimum, these should be the four mainline pillars or focus areas of your framework. And then from a policy standpoint, again, most companies we talk to look at policies from a security only, but it's important to build have automation tools that can automate your processes and policies as well. For instance, here, this is an example of a cost policy where a policy keeps track of cost of resources and then looks for overlap. So being able to look for ways to automate, increase utilization. Another security, that one's pretty straightforward, looking for security vulnerabilities that we've defined. And then the third, or the top one, or kind of the third category bucket is around access. Are we, as a company, if we've defined role-based access requirements, is that being followed? And this is just, again, 35 or 30,000 foot view. We have a very a long list of policies in our platform, and we'd love to go over that with you more in detail in a separate demo. So please reach out to us. Now, I talked about this a little bit, right? It's about prevention. Most of the focus from a governance standpoint is prevention. So they'll put the firewalls in place. You put your security group rules. You make sure that your storage isn't public. You encrypt everything. If it's regulatory compliance, you try to follow all their requirements from a prevention standpoint. Again, the key, though, is to be able to have the right tooling and automation in place to be able to detect the violation when it happens. And most importantly, the biggest area, the biggest focus should be around correction. And most importantly, automating that process of correction whenever possible. Some things you're not going to want to automate, right? If it's a production workload and you see a security port violation, you probably wouldn't want to go just automatically shut that down. That could then cut off potential users. Or an S3 bucket in production's public. Let's not automate the process of making that private because that could cut off our end customers from getting access to that environment. But some things like encryption, if you have regulatory compliance, if you are in the healthcare industry or online retail for PCI, you need to make sure that all your personally identified information, all your PPI, is encrypted at rest and in transit. So if a violation will occur where someone deployed a resource and the encryption wasn't enabled, then we could automate that process. That would not stop them from what they were doing. However, it makes sure that we're following regulatory requirements. So again, it's PDR, prevention, detection, and resolution or correction. So PDR, PDC. Do you want to do a quick CoreStack overview?
Thank you, Tony. That was really an insightful overview. And I really liked your analogy of government and cloud governance. Thank you very much. So for the next few minutes, I will introduce CoreStack to you all, particularly what's the key business value we have to offer. And then I'll pass it back to Tony so that he can walk you through the solution demo and explain some of the concepts that he has just given an overview on the framework and governance strategy. So CoreStack, who is CoreStack? How and how have we been helping the customers in managing and governing the cloud governance? So CoreStack is a cloud governance platform, and we focus on making governance autonomous and intelligent. So this couple of words are very important, something which you will here and probably relate to as we even show you the product demonstration. We really aim at making your governance autonomous and intelligent so that you achieve the following key business benefits. Primarily, we focus on promoting your agility. As Tony was explaining to you in the framework, especially the 4Cs governance which CoreStack provides, we provide you with a self-service capability. And on top of it, if you include orchestration, what it means is enabling your developers, your users to be more agile, and hence you as an organization gain a competitive advantage of significantly reducing your time to market. The second important one, which I believe all of us in some way or the other have this KPI of reducing the costs. When we're talking about reducing the cloud costs, it's again primarily because of a couple of important reasons. It's about the orchestration that we bring in, and importantly, through visibility, how you're going to optimize the various resources you're consuming. The third important aspect, one key business benefit which most of the enterprises would be keen to have, is to minimize the business disruptions, particularly with an automated redundancy and proactive remediation. And by doing this, we not only through the other pillars like promoting agility and reducing cloud costs, we help you as an enterprise gain the promise of cloud, realize it, and while you're doing all of this, you're also making sure that you're mitigating your security risk and staying compliant by automating governance. And when we're saying being compliant with governance policies, we mean a couple of things here. One is the enterprise IT governance that you have defined for your organization worldwide. And the second important thing is what are those regulatory frameworks that you need to follow because you are part of an industry and there are some industry specific guidelines to be followed, right? So this is what CoreStack does. This is an overview. Our overall focus is to eliminate the waste in your infrastructure spend, your operations, so that you can put that back into more innovative efforts for your customers. Now let me walk you through a quick story of one of our customers. It's one of the biggest financial services companies in Asia, based out of India. It's CAMS. They have used CoreStack for some of their orchestration related works, and they have seen some significant business advantages, which I wanted to share with you. A brief customer background. CAMS is one of the biggest, as I told you, in Asia, and of course the biggest in India, and it serves across 15 mutual funds, have about 7,000 employees across 270 different offices. So that gives you an example of how wide their operations are. And when they reached out to us, some of the specific challenges that they were discussing with us were around. To give you a bit of background, they were relatively new to cloud, and they started with just one or two workloads, and they wanted to get a feel of how they would really maximize the benefits of the cloud, just like all of us would want to when we transition from on-premise workloads to a cloud-based, more agile workloads, right? Now, they expected that the IT infrastructure costs are going to go low, which is again a very common vision every leadership team of an IT organization has. But what they realized is they were actually starting to spend more. And adding to this, they didn't have enough expertise to govern security and compliance of cloud, and someone who can define the best practices and make them adopt cloud in a more automated, in a more effective manner so that they can confidently move other applications to cloud. So these were the challenges that they were grappling with, and hence they didn't have enough confidence. These challenges were really acting as a deterrent for them to move the rest of the applications onto the cloud. And it was not a great situation to be in. So they had literally two options in front of them. Either they can get some consulting services who can correct all of this, but the leadership team there was more focused on bringing in innovation through a platform, through a product, so that they're not dependent on people, but it's more a process-driven approach. Let's have a quick look at what kind of a solution that they finally implemented. After evaluating a bunch of options, like I just mentioned to you, it's a product versus a consulting kind of a scenario. They decided to go with a product, a CoreStack Enterprise platform, And few of the modules that they have implemented specifically to overcome the challenges which I've just mentioned to you are related to cloud ops orchestration, how they can automate various stages of the IT life cycle so that they can do some of the common tasks like provisioning, monitoring, and even remediation as much as possible through an automatic data-driven solution. Second, being a financial services company, it was very important for them to be compliant with the security and the governance standards as per the industry norms. So they implemented the compliance model of CoreStack Enterprise. And importantly, as we all want, they also were keen to understand how the cloud spend is and what are the areas where they can optimize the cloud spend. So the cost analytics dashboard is the another module of CoreStack that they went live with. Now, interestingly, if you can have a look at the results, this is something very close to me because I was involved in interviewing the customer. I was speaking to some of the senior people out there who were involved in this implementation process. And within about 3 months of their implementation, they could realize a cloud cost reduction of about 60%. And that's quite significant, primarily because I mentioned that one of the things that was really challenging for them is the escalating cloud cost was not motivating enough for them to use cloud at a larger scale. Now, this number was really motivating, where they can consider now moving the applications more confidently onto cloud. And the fact that there's a lot of orchestration that has been brought in, a lot of automation, they could save a lot of manual effort. The number that we could come out based on their savings is about 150 hours per month, which they now are using for more value-added services than just monitoring or provisioning the infrastructure or managing the cloud on the whole. Very importantly, for any enterprise, when they move to cloud, one of the key expectations that they have is minimal disruptions to the business. Hence, a very, very high percentage of cloud availability is required. And that's what was demonstrated from this implementation of a 99.99% cloud availability for the applications which they have automated using CoreStack. A quick look at what the senior vice president, who was a champion for us in implementing the solution, says. The detailed case study of this is available on the CoreStack website, or feel free to reach out to us so we can provide more detailed insights on how this implementation was all carried out and what are those different orchestration capabilities of CoreStack which the customer has used. So on that note, Tony, I'll pass it back to you to walk us through some of the key capabilities from the product point of view, especially keeping in mind the framework that you explained at the beginning. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you. So again, I'm going to go through this really quickly. We don't have a lot of time, but please reach out to us. I'm more than happy to give you a demo specifically around your requirements. But what I'm going to focus on is just 3 use case areas in which we went over today. And so if you look at our main dashboard, we have our 4 main dashboard tabs: cloud operations, compliance, cost analytics, and consumption, which follows that governance framework. So you defined your governance framework. You have these 4 pillars. Inside of that is process, compliance, security. All of that is built as part of those 4 pillars. So we've defined our product to follow those 4 pillars to make it very easy to adopt cloud, as well as to be able to utilize the appropriate tooling to follow that framework. So the 3 particular use cases I'm going to focus on is around workload constraints, a security issue, and then a process. So I'm going to cover those 3 kind of violations or areas. So first, here on a cloud operations standpoint, what you're seeing right now is data that our platform is gathering from the subscriptions that I have added. So in this particular environment, I have 2 AWS subscriptions that CoreStack is managing and governing, and 2 Azure subscriptions. Oh, and I have a VMware environment that I'm managing and governing as well. And so as soon as I add those subscriptions, I define my governance framework. I define my backup and retention policy. I define my tagging standards. I define my security policies, any regulatory compliance. I talked about backups, reporting, monitoring. All of that is configured through our wizard. All of that is supported using best practices. So if you were to add on an AWS subscription, for instance, we're using AWS's best practice for governance as our baseline, as the baseline like wizard or bot. And then it will walk you through asking a bunch of questions to help you build out your governance framework. So if you haven't built a cloud center of excellence yet, or you're still going through that process and you need help, please reach out to us, because not only can our tooling help you through that process through our wizard, but we're more than happy to help you through that as well. So jumping into this from a cloud operations standpoint, continual operations, continual observability, I identified thresholds. So this is a production environment. I want to make sure that all of my resources in this subscription or this environment is under 85% CPU utilization. So I started a stress test a few minutes ago. So it's peaking out one of my VMs here in my Azure environment. So if we go look at that, it's this Acme Ubuntu. You can get all this information from CoreStack. I just like to show it in the actual service providers portal so you can see the change happen, show you that it's real. So here it is. This is the resource Acme Ubuntu, the IP address, and here's the resources right here. So it's a B1MS with 1 virtual CPU and 2 gigs of memory. It's peaking, and you can see here it's been peaking for the last 45 minutes. So my customers, my users, my end customers are probably having a very poor experience accessing this resource. So from here, I've been alerted. So I received an alert, which lets me know that I have an audit trail alert that's being run in my environment. Receive a text, SMX, receive it via email. Right from here, you can click, which will take them right into the alert. So I could see this Acme Ubuntu. I have 2 violations here. Both are peaking at 95.07% CPU, which is going over my threshold of 85. So I can look at the actual data. Now we have an AI and ML engine that's gathering all this data and creating forecasts and predictions. Since this is a demo workload and I will do a full stress test randomly when we do demos and then it's sitting idle a lot of the time, you'll notice that the accuracy of our forecast is low. So as CoreStack makes forecasts and predictions, it's also going back to measure the accuracy. So depending on the workload, you can adjust your predictions based off the accuracy as well. And we do a lot of that. A lot of that is built into our ML, our machine learning algorithms. So you can see this is what we're predicting over time. So it's letting me know that, oh, okay, in the next few weeks, I'm going to need to add more resources to this workload. I can also set a buffer to say, if it goes up and below this, let me know. Send me another alert. I could ignore this and say, that's fine, it's just development, I don't care, or I could actually just go resolve it right now. And again, everything I'm showing you today can be done automatically. So this is something we could set up the action to be automatic. So we can automatically resize workloads and then resize them back down as well. So in essence, we can set up auto scaling, or not in essence, we could set up auto scaling without having to pay for and use auto scaling services. So just to resolve this issue right now, I want to get rid of that constraint. Let's take an action to resolve this by adding more resource power. So here's the resource. I'm going to move it up to a standard B2MS, which is going to double the RAM and memory. So hit run now. That's going to run a template. Now, the neat thing on the back end, which we didn't talk about today, is our platform utilizes native DSL templates. So it uses CloudFormation and ARM templates to make all of this happen. So it's very easy to add new actions in here and new tasks. So I could add my own template to, when it hits this 85% threshold, to redeploy it in another environment or in another service provider. So that should have, if I hit refresh here, see, I doubled the CPU and memory. So now I have 2 virtual CPU, 2 gigs of memory. That will clear out this threshold, hopefully, because the CPU utilization should drop down. If it doesn't, it would alert me again, and then I can go and even add more resources if I needed. Oh, another thing is too, we could snooze these or we could schedule these. So I could tell CoreStack that I want to wait, I'm going to add more resources during our next maintenance window tonight at 3 a.m. instead of doing it maybe in the middle of the day. Let's let our users may experience some issues, but I don't want to chance doing something by adding more resources. So there's multiple different ways to automate the action or the resolution. The next one I want to show you is our compliance dashboard. So we've defined that framework through our onboarding wizard. We have a discovery mechanism that utilizes a bunch of native APIs and services from the service providers to gather as much data as we can. So we have a complete current snapshot of everything that is in your environment. From that, now we have a dashboard which will show you, kind of like a FICA score, how you're doing on each category. So I can see I have quite a few violations here, standards. Those could be, right, tagging. People have deployed resources and didn't put the appropriate tags that we required as a company. That's another thing we could automate, going out and fixing those tags or adding tags as well. Cost optimization, and which would be maybe setting up policies to look for long-running resources, or if it's a development environment, let's automatically shut all our resources down at 6 p.m. and fire them back up at 6 a.m. Save costs, right? If no one's developing at night, let's just shut them down. They could always spin them back up if they wanted. Security is one that most customers will focus on, right? We need to isolate and correct these vulnerabilities right away. So before I did this demo, I went into my AWS production account and I spun up a few S3 buckets and I made them public. As an enterprise, I defined my governance framework saying that this is invalid, whether it's regulatory compliance or just our business security framework. All S3 buckets need to be private. For demo purposes, I didn't automate this process, but let's go look at these specifically. So I can see I have 22 different security vulnerabilities right now. And as soon as that S3 bucket's triggered, we're using Cloud Tail and Cloud Tracker to gather that data, and then it will be displayed here in the dashboard. I'll also receive an email alert letting me know that, hey, someone spun up an S3 bucket. It's violating our security policy of having all of these S3 buckets encrypted or public or private, excuse me. So I can see here, okay, I have this demo public 3, right? Demo public 3, it's public. So let's look at the specifics and then let's go take an action. So here I'm looking at that single instance which we talked about, but if I just want to look at all of the violations too, I could either hit this recommendation tab. So this is a tab which is recommending actions to resolve all of your governance compliance. Again, the idea is to get to a score of 0 where every category has 0 vulnerabilities. Or if I select here in security, I can look at all of my security violations. So you can see I have multiple different violations for multiple accounts. I have a network security group rule violation here. So that means most likely resource has been spun up and it's 0 access. So anybody on the internet has access to it. So maybe I would want to close that down. For this demo, let's look at this production account. We'll look at that public demo 3. And let's just take the action of modifying its access list to private. So I hit apply. Gives me my options for my particular account. My only other option is private, so I'm going to hit apply action. And if I go back and look at this and hit refresh, I might have timed out. There we go. It's now been set to private. Again, for demo purposes, I left it. I did this manually. This could be something where you could, in the policy, you define the action in multiple different ways. You could have CoreStack, when this violation occurs, automatically go and shut down or change the access list. I could have CoreStack send an email to the user, tell them, hey, we shut this down. You have 24 hours to go fix it, or we're going to terminate it. I could spit up a ticket in ServiceNow or fire up a ticket in ServiceNow. There's all sorts of different activities we can take as part of kind of the next steps, the correction. So again, identifying the process and identifying the discovery method, what the trigger or the monitoring alert is, and then what the action is. What do you want CoreStack to do when this violation occurs? And there's multiple different variables you can set up as well as part of that activity. So there could be a variable at if you have an a violation and it stays that way for 12 hours, then automatically do it. So there's multiple different ways we can set up the resolution or the correction of that violation. The third one I want to talk about is, this is more around misconfiguration. So being able to streamline and automate that process for your users. One of the issues we run into all the time with our customers is a lot of time customers have defined their tagging standards. So for our line of business users, we want to make sure they have all of these tags. And so if I show you this environment, and we're almost out of time here, but if I look at my resources and I look at my particular tags, you could see here as a company, I wanted cost center in lowercase, environment written out, production written out in all lowercase, demo should be all lowercase. So my users followed my process of putting the right tags in. However, whether it's typo or people just type things differently, they're actually not in there how I wanted them. And so on the back end, from a cost analytics and monitoring standpoint, all of these different values show up separately. So we have a customer that we're working with that has 5 variables. Well, that ends up on the back end from a billing standpoint being 2,500 different options between fat fingering, misspelling, and just typing it, right, with case sensitive or non-case sensitive like this. So we have templates that can run, right? This would be automated. So I have this automated to run multiple times throughout the day. So if anyone spins up an environment, we have our machine learning algorithm that does a discovery. It will learn what tags are there. It will auto-correct them if it can, if it has the logic behind the scenes to know what to do, and then we'll come and correct those tags. So you can see here it corrected it, changed all my tags to how I want them as a business: environment, production, cost center, demo, through all of my resources. So I've sanitized and cleaned up that data, which means now from a cost analytics, reporting, and budget standpoint, I have good, clean, sanitized data which I can use for my business. So with that, those are 3 separate use cases. Again, we appreciate your time. If you have any questions, we can go through them now. I know we're at the end, top of the hour. Abid, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Tony. In the interest of time, probably we can take one quick question, Tony. There are a bunch of interesting questions here, but I will read out one really interesting question that do you recommend a different governance framework for each of the public clouds like AWS, Azure, and on-premise data center, which is an hybrid cloud, or treat all of them under one structure? What are the pros and cons?
Yeah, so great question. One of the challenges with adopting and building a governance framework is, each service provider has different services and best practices for governing their environment and tooling. And so that's why as an enterprise, what ends up happening is you end up having kind of 3 governance frameworks. You have your enterprise governance framework for how you want to use and consume the cloud, what's going to help you achieve your goals and initiatives. Then you'll have individual frameworks for each one of the service providers. Well, with AWS, we enable these monitoring services. We have these standards for alerting and tagging and automation. The services are different. The naming conventions are different. The policies are different. If you're in Azure, the same thing, although similar from maybe a framework standpoint, the actual how you implement the services as well as the required skill set for your operations staff is completely different. And that's where having a tool like CoreStack can help. You will build your overall governance framework from an enterprise level, and CoreStack figures out everything else. It has the translation on the back end. It knows what to do and what services and what best practices to use in order to implement your high-level enterprise governance framework. So it's a way to simplify enforcing your governance processes and policies for all your infrastructure on-prem as well. So yeah, great question.
Thank you, Tony. As I told, we have a few more questions, but I'm afraid we will have to take them offline with each of the people who have asked them. But I would like to thank everyone for your time, and I hope you found the session useful. And as I told at the beginning, you'll be getting a recorded version of the webinar along with the presentation. And if you need any more detailed insights, feel free to let us know. We'd be happy to help with a one-on-one demo. But until then, thank you very much. Thank you, Tony, for your great demo, and wish you all a great day ahead. Bye-bye.
Thank you.